Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on descriptive meaning of culture. This lecture is part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will discuss the descriptive meaning of culture. The idea of description arises as people engage in understanding culture in different ways, be it through textual or experiential knowledge. The present lecture will engage with how scholars studied culture in the global context and with specific reference to, of course, India. Any discussion about studying culture in Indian context has to address the way scholars engaged with understanding culture. During colonialism in India, administrators, missionaries, and anthropologists attempted to understand Indian culture by observing various institutions in Indian society. Although such constructions may be alien and undertaken for a political purpose during that period, however, one needs to deconstruct the meanings associated with the term in the Indian context. When we use the term descriptive, what is referred here is the demographic descriptions of the non-European societies studied by European scholars in depicting culture. This conception is now less concerned with the ennoblement of the mind which was emphasized in the classical meaning. It rather focuses on unraveling the customs, practices, and beliefs of the non-European societies seen as the other. Edward Tylor is credited with the establishment of the descriptive conception of culture in his 2 volumes of Primitive Cultures, Researches into Development of Mythology, Philosophy, Religion, Art, and Customs. He refers a very famous definition of culture that contains key elements of descriptive conception. According to Tylor, I quote, "Culture or civilization is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and many other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society," unquote. The definition presents culture as a complex whole, and one of the crucial tasks of any researcher trying to study civilization is to dissect these wholes into component parts and to classify and compare them in a scientific manner. For instance, when Tylor studied the geographical contribution of myths, he first classified the myths under such headings as myths of sunrise and sunset, eclipse myths, earthquake myths, and many such categories. Tylor says that the geographical distribution of myths and their transmission from region to region have to be studied as the natural studies the geography of his botanical or geological species. Just as the catalogue of all the species of plants and animals of a district represents its flora and fauna, so the list of all items of the general life of a people represents what is called culture for Tylor. This may sound very interesting, but this is a problem in Tylor's analysis of culture. First of all, Tylor's evolutionary theory differentially grades civilizations. On the one end of this gradation are the savage tribes, and the other end is the Europe, which is defined as the cultured and educated world. In his evolutionary scheme, the industrial world becomes the measure of civilization. Such evolutionary and positivist frameworks ideologically promoted the expansion of colonialism and exploitation of the natural resources of non-industrial societies such as Africa and Asia. After Tylor, it was Bronislaw Malinowski who developed a scientific theory of culture that exemplifies another version of the descriptive conception of culture. He also endorsed the evolutionary perspective. Malinowski is seen as the founder of functionalist theory of culture. Through his ethnographic study of Trobriand and people who lived in Papua New Guinea, Malinowski developed his functionalist theory. In his definition, the cultural phenomena is analyzed in terms of the satisfaction of human needs. And this is the reason his theory is called the functional view of culture, as it argues that every type of civilization, custom, idea and belief fulfills some vital function and therefore is an indispensable part for the working of the whole society. For instance, he studied the Kula system of exchange of gifts among the Trubanders. He lived among them as a native for months, observing their social, religious, political and economic life. He found a remarkable system of exchange called Kula, which the islanders maintain among themselves and with the inhabitants of the neighboring islands. In Kula trade, people exchange bracelet and necklace made of ordinary materials but are considered valuable. This led Malinowski to think that what functions does Kula trade serve for which tribals take dangerous voyages through the sea? The reciprocal exchanges in Kula trade studied by Malinowski inspired a generation of scholars to carry out transactional analysis and its functions in maintaining a social order and control in society. He pointed out that the curious circulation of valuables, which takes place between the inhabitants of the Truband and the islands, which, while accompanied by ordinary trade, is by no means itself a purely commercial transaction. He shows that it's not based on a simple calculation of utility or profit or loss, but that it satisfies emotional and aesthetic needs. Therefore, according to Malinowski, culture comprises inherited artifacts, goods, and technical processes, ideas, habits, and values. The task of the social scientist is therefore to break this social heritage down into its component elements and relate them to the environment and needs of the human organism. So it's an analysis of the functions of cultural phenomena in terms of how they satisfy human needs. Malinowski's functionalist theory of culture is criticized, of course, for being crudely utilitarian, meaning by that everything exists to serve a purpose. Both Teller and Malinowski failed to study culture in relation to the material aspects of living. Despite the different emphasis in the Teller and Malinowski and others' definition of culture, there exists a common view of culture in their definitions. And that common view is that cataloging or classification of various elements of culture. And that's why it is clubbed together into the descriptive conception of culture. With these brief remarks on descriptive conception of culture, now let's discuss the symbolic conception of culture, which is close to the theorization of culture and communication. Studies of culture in India began under the rubric of colonial rulers. Colonialists were interested in studying the people of India as they realized that the knowledge of Indian culture and social life was indispensable to smooth rule. Since the Indian society and culture were totally unfamiliar to the colonial rulers, they studied and documented as many as possible aspects of the lives of people of India. So it was almost similar to classifying the cultural aspects for better governance. D.N. Danagare says that the development of social sciences in general corresponds with the development of modern industrial capitalism in Europe. M.N. Srinivas writes in this regard that, I quote, "The need to govern men of various races and vastly different cultures created in the European rulers a need to study the life and culture of the ruled," unquote. According to Danagare, the expansion of Western capitalism and imperialism was bound for confrontation with traditional societies which were colonized, for instance, in this case, India. So studies on culture in India developed out of this encounter between the colonizer and the colonized. So we can say that such studies were useful instrument of colonial domination. The colonial administrators and missionaries in India, like other parts of the world, wrote several monographs about the Indian people and their way of life. They carried out several ethnographic studies and published ethnographic compilations of traditions, customs, and beliefs of different tribes and castes in various provinces of India. Not only this, In fact, detailed studies on physical attributes of caste and tribes were also carried out. Let's cite a few examples of the ethnographic work carried out by British administrators and anthropologists and scholars in India. In 1769, Henry Warelst, the governor of Bengal and Bihar, stressed the importance of collecting information regarding the customs of leading families in his directives to revenue supervisors. Since then, many British officials and missionaries had made earnest efforts to collect and record information regarding the life and culture of their Indian subjects. In 1807, Francis Buchanan undertook the ethnographic survey of Bengal. Then between 1809 and 1813, he carried out one of the most detailed surveys of the social and cultural history of Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh. Abbé de Bois, a French missionary in Mysore, wrote in 1816 a book entitled Hindu Manners, Customs. He wrote about the life, ritual of the people he lived amongst. He was also one to study caste and interrelations. There were many other British administrators who also wrote compendia on tribes and castes on India. For instance, Herbert Risley, a British ethnographer and colonial administrator and a member of the Indian Civil Services, conducted ethnographic surveys of Bengal Presidency. In 1885, the Lieutenant General of Bengal selected Risley to collect detailed information on the caste and tribes of that province. The tribes and caste of Bengal was the result of this work. In addition to such ethnographic compilations, Britishers undertook the first All India census in 1871 for the first time, which became an invaluable source of information not only for demographic studies but also for social and cultural analysis. Along with this, British scholars introduced Indological studies to become more familiar with the life and culture of Indians. British Orientalist William Jones played a great role in founding the study of Sanskrit and Indology in the Western world. Although Jones exported Sanskrit and Indology to the world, but his understanding of the subject is free from suspect. Chowdhury in 2012 rightly points out that Sir William Jones, while writing about the antiquity of history of India, confines up to 11th century. It implies that prior to British arrival in India, there was no history. It was considered as dark period as the entry of Britishers automatically led to the fading of darkness. This is very, very interesting. This selective inclusion reflects in a way the hidden intent and motive behind writing such history. In 1987, John Drew comments that, I quote, "The curious way in which Jones is absorbed in his Asian civilization even while he asserts the superiority of Europeans is equally evident in his work, including on the philosophy of the Asiatics. In his perspective on India, Drew says that Jones sometimes appears to have been as hazed in as any man by his sense of the superiority of Indian culture and by his acknowledgement of the prior claims of Christian revelation." Unquote. Jones established the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1787. Asiatic Society began to publish essays related to Indian culture, but all those were written by government officials and missionaries who had no academic interest. With the beginning of the 20th century, along with the British administrators and missionaries, European scholars began to be attracted to study culture in India. For instance, W.H.R. Rivers wrote The Todars, which was based on intensive field work. Rivers' study was followed by Radcliffe Brown's study on the Andaman Islands. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 2 Indian scholars, L.K. Anantakrishna Nair and S.C. Roy, wrote accounts of caste tribes. Anantakrishna Nair produced accounts of caste and tribes of Cochin and Mysore, and also a study of the Syrian Christians of Kerala. Roy, on the other hand, wrote monographic accounts of several tribes in Bihar. Roy also wrote a book entitled Caste, Race and Religion in India in 1934. With the establishment of ethnographic survey by the British government in 1905, many such surveys were carried out in India. Many journals devoted to the study of Indian culture were started by Indians. From 1900 to 1920, many Indian scholars came into picture and wrote extensively on India. Along with borrowing from the European and American traditions of social sciences, the Indian social scientists wrote with a plea to establish an Indian way of thinking different from European scholarships. Scholars like S.C. Dubey, Leela Dubey, D.P. Mukherjee and A.R. Desai wrote with a critical understanding on culture and society in India. These scholars have studied immensely the cultural institutions in the villages and its role in nation building. These studies were initiated under the influence of modernization and development projects in India. Indian villages were crucial in projecting the image of India as a developing nation that can stand on its own. Villagers were seen as the epitome of nation's socio-cultural and economic life and representing the core values of Indian civilization. The information that was collected by economists, political scientists and sociologists under the auspices of nation building program consisted of all socio-cultural aspects of a village life. Institutions like Planning Commission, Nation Sample Survey, they were constituted to spearhead the collection of such data on the culture of village life. Therefore, we can call it a descriptive analysis of culture in the villages of India. To cite an example of such descriptive studies of Indian villages is studies on Palanpur. Palanpur, a village in Muradabad district of Uttar Pradesh, is a village that has been surveyed several times to analyze the changes in the culture of Indian villages due to the technological advancement. Culture is grounded in the social, economic and political setting of the village. Therefore, detailed descriptions were documented on the impact of technology on various socio-economic and political structures. Details of demographic structure, occupational structure in terms of caste and gender, they were also documented. The scholars have analyzed the decline in agricultural occupations with the emergence of non-agricultural wage employment. They've also analyzed the decline of the relationship between caste and occupation because of the introduction of technology. One of the primary aspects highlighted was how technology has facilitated the occupational mobility of Dalits. For instance, it was observed that those castes which were engaged in hereditary occupations such as water carriers and oil pressers have been freed from this work due to the introduction of technology. D. N. Madhumdar's work, Caste and Communication in an Indian Village, is another benchmark study analyzing the transformation of culture in Indian villages through the intervention of technologies of communication. This study also been seen as a significant contribution in the study of culture and communication in India. Majumdar documents the changes in the patterns of communication in a village called Mohana, which was 8 miles away from Lucknow city. He describes the role of radio, newspaper, postal services, education, and messengers in the cultural life of a village. He demonstrates the coexistence of traditional and modern means of communication and how technologically oriented means of communication were being culturally negotiated by the people in the village. Basically, he documents the cultural negotiations at various levels of village life. In this unit, you have studied the development of descriptive conception of culture as it emerged within the social science literature. We have traced its development from Britain to India, it was explained to you that the colonial interest played a very significant role in the development of such conceptualization. This conceptualization was further transformed with the dream of an independent nation and its modernization. A documentation of impact of technology on the social, economic, and political culture of villages was a primary site of such conceptualization. Friends, hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions given at the end of your text. Thank you very much indeed.